"Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back behind the visitor line." The staff sergeant's voice carried across the firing line with practiced authority. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that came from a fresh promotion and a clipboard full of regulations. The high desert air at Fort Irwin shimmered, distorting the distant targets into wavering apparitions. It was a place of brutal heat and surgical precision, a proving ground where the newest generation of American warfighters tested the bleeding edge of military technology. Today was all about optics and ballistics. Brigadier General Madsen stood behind the firing line, a solid man whose crisp new multicam uniform seemed immune to the dust and sweat that clung to everyone else. He spoke with the clipped certainty of a man who reads reports more than he reads the wind. "The future of standoff engagement is data, Sergeant," he announced to the man beside him. "Integrated rangefinders, atmospheric sensors, predictive algorithms. The shooter becomes a system manager, not some mystic reading tea leaves in the mirage." Sergeant Cole, the rangemaster and chief sniper instructor, just nodded. He'd heard it all before. He'd also seen a $1,000 scope fail in a sandstorm, while a Marine with a well-maintained piece of glass and a gut feeling made a career-ending shot. He respected the general's rank, but he trusted experience more than data sheets. It was then that the car appeared, a cloud of dust trailing it like a memory. A late 90s station wagon, the color of faded denim, rumbled down the access road and parked in the designated civilian area. The driver's side door opened, and a woman emerged. She couldn't have been younger than 70, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and a network of fine lines around her eyes that spoke of decades squinting into the sun. She wore simple khaki pants and a loose linen shirt. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if conserving energy, and opened the rear of the wagon. From it, she carefully slid a long, heavy-looking rifle case, the kind of rugged Pelican case Cole knew could survive a fall from a helicopter. It looked absurdly large in her arms, yet she handled its weight with a practiced ease that was the first thing to snag Cole's professional attention. He'd seen recruits half her age struggle with a case that size. She didn't struggle. She simply compensated, using leverage and balance in a way that was both subtle and deeply impressive. General Madsen followed Cole's gaze and let out a short, dismissive sigh. "What's this, Sergeant? Did the Base Historical Society decide to have a picnic?" His voice was loud enough to carry, a casual cruelty born of unchecked authority. Who cleared a civilian, let alone that, onto a live-fire Tier 1 training range? Cole felt a prickle of irritation. He didn't know who the woman was, but he knew the kind of quiet dignity she carried, and it deserved better than the general's parade ground arrogance. "She has clearance, sir. Came down from CENTCOM, actually. Name's Alara Finch. Said she was here to reacquaint herself with an old friend." Madsen scoffed, turning his attention back to a young shooter wrestling with a new digital scope. "An old friend?" "Let me guess." He gestured vaguely toward the woman, who was now setting up at the far end of the line, well away from the others. "Some Vietnam-era relic she wants to plink with. Make sure she stays behind the line, Sergeant. We don't need a civilian incident report on top of everything else today." Cole watched as Alara opened her case. It wasn't a Vietnam-era M40. The weapon she began to assemble was a Barrett M82A1. The sheer, brutal functionality of the .50 caliber anti-materiel rifle was unmistakable. But this one was different from the factory-new models the Army was fielding. The finish was worn smooth along the receiver, and the grip polished by the countless touch of hands. The bipod had tiny scratches, each one a story. It wasn't a museum piece, it was a tool, used and respected and maintained with the kind of obsessive care that only comes from knowing your life depends on it. Madsen noticed it too, and his condescension shifted to a kind of amused disbelief. "A Barrett? Good Lord, what's she planning on shooting, a T-72? That thing has more recoil than a mule kick. She'll be lucky if it doesn't dislocate her shoulder." He shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "This I have to see. It'll be the highlight of the inspection." He was treating it as a joke, a piece of live entertainment arranged for his benefit. Alara Finch seemed oblivious to the attention. She worked with an unhurried, methodical rhythm that was mesmerizing to Cole. Every action was efficient, stripped of any wasted movement. She locked the upper and lower receivers together with a solid clack that echoed slightly in the dry air. She attached the heavy barrel, her hands, though wrinkled, moving with the steadiness of a surgeon. She mounted a scope that looked as old as the rifle, its turret caps worn down to the brass underneath. There were no digital readouts, no laser rangefinders attached, just glass and steel. When the rifle was assembled, she didn't rush to the firing position. She pulled a small worn leather pouch from her pocket and produced a simple wind meter, holding it up and watching the tiny propeller spin. She glanced at the flags downrange, her eyes scanning the terrain, noting the way the heat haze danced over a shallow ravine 2/3 of the way to the target berm. She was reading the environment, absorbing its data in a way no sensor could. Cole found himself holding his breath. This was not the work of a hobbyist. This was a ritual. She finally settled into a prone position behind the monstrous rifle. The movement was fluid, a single practiced motion that ended with her body perfectly aligned with the weapon. She was a small woman, but behind the Barrett, she seemed to become part of it, anchored to the earth. Her breathing, which Cole watched by the subtle rise and fall of her back, slowed until it was almost imperceptible. One breath in, a long, slow breath out. A pause in the natural respiratory cycle. Cole knew that pause. It was the space where the world went silent, where the trigger press was an unconscious thought, where there was nothing but the shooter, the crosshairs, and the target. General Madsen, however, saw none of this. He was back to talking about data links and satellite-assisted targeting with a young lieutenant. He'd already dismissed her. For him, the show was over before it began. He saw an old woman with an old gun, a piece of living history that didn't fit into his neat digitized vision of the modern battlefield. Wanting to punctuate his point about precision technology, Madsen gestured expansively downrange. Look at that, Lieutenant. At 1,800 meters, our new system can tell you the barometric pressure, humidity, and Coriolis effect. It can give you a 95% first-shot hit probability on a stationary vehicle. He then pointed to the very edge of the range, at a target so small it was almost invisible without powerful optics. It was a steel challenge pin, a 2-inch disc hanging from a small chain, used only by the most elite snipers for bragging rights shots. The sun glinted off its edge. "Ask your fancy computer to hit that," he said with a laugh, then raised his voice. "Sergeant Cole, let's give the lady a real challenge. Tell her if she can hit that pin, I'll buy the whole range a round of drinks." It was a joke, a public dismissal meant to highlight the absurdity of her presence. Cole felt his face flush with anger. The shot was borderline impossible. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and at that distance, the 2-inch target was a speck. It was a fool's errand designed to humiliate her. Cole started to walk over, to tell her to ignore the general, but he stopped. Alara Finch hadn't even looked their way. But he saw her left hand, the one supporting the rifle, make a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. He saw her eye, pressed against the scope, twitch slightly as she adjusted her focus. She had heard. She wasn't ignoring the challenge. She was accepting it. Cole walked back to the general's side, his expression grim. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not a reasonable..." But Madsen waved him off. "Nonsense, Sergeant. A little fun." The air on the range grew quiet. The other shooters, sensing the strange drama unfolding, had paused their training. All eyes were on the old woman at the end of the line. She remained motionless for a full minute, her body a statue of concentration. Cole watched her through his own binoculars. He saw her make one single infinitesimal click of adjustment on the scope's windage knob. One click, for a shot over a mile away in a shifting wind. It was an act of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. Then, the world erupted. The report of the .50 BMG wasn't the sharp crack of smaller calibers. It was a deep concussive roar that slammed into your chest and seemed to shake the very ground. The rifle bucked against Alara's shoulder, but her body absorbed the colossal recoil as if it were an old, familiar dance partner. The massive muzzle brake kicked up a plume of dust and sand. For a long, drawn-out second, there was only the sound of the projectile tearing through the air, a faint, fading whistle. Madsen was already smirking, ready with another dismissive comment. And then it came. From 1,800 meters away, a sound traveled back to them, small but clear and utterly unmistakable in the sudden silence. A sharp, metallic ping. It wasn't the dull thud of a bullet hitting the berm. It was the high-frequency ring of hardened steel being struck by a copper-jacketed round traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The challenge pin, which had been glinting in the sun, was simply gone. A stunned silence fell over the firing line. Even the cicadas seemed to have paused. General Madsen's smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. He grabbed the spotting scope from the lieutenant, fumbling with the focus. "Zoom in! Get the camera on it!" he barked, his voice tight. On the large monitor that showed the target feed, the view zoomed in on the stand where the pin had been. The chain was still there, swinging gently, but the 2-inch steel disc was gone, not knocked off, not dented. It had been obliterated, sheared from its mounting point by the kinetic force of the impact. The shot hadn't just hit the pin, it had vaporized its connection to the world. Madsen lowered the spotting scope, his face pale. He looked from the monitor to the old woman, who was now calmly pulling back the charging handle, ejecting the massive smoking brass casing. He turned to Sergeant Cole, his eyes wide with a question he couldn't articulate. Cole, who had been standing rigid, his mind racing, finally found his voice. It was barely a whisper, a name spoken with the reverence of a prayer. The ghost of Zabarwan. The name hung in the hot desert air. It wasn't from a textbook or an official history. It was a legend, a piece of sniper folklore passed down in quiet conversations in ready rooms and forward operating bases. Stories of a phantom shooter from a long-disbanded, deeply classified task force who operated in the treacherous Zabarwan mountain range. A shooter credited with impossible shots, shots that bent the laws of physics, who could hit targets through loopholes in fortifications, between the rotor blades of a hovering helicopter. The ghost's identity was the stuff of myth. Some said it was a man, some said a woman, some said it wasn't a person at all, but a call sign passed down. But the one constant in every story was the call sign, and the almost supernatural skill it represented. The general's mind reeled. He'd heard those stories as a young captain, dismissing them as barracks exaggerations. Now, the legend was calmly packing up her rifle 50 feet away. The arrogance drained out of him like water from a sieve, replaced by a cold, profound wave of humility. He felt like a fool. He walked toward her, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. He felt the eyes of every soldier on the range on him, but he didn't care. His entire worldview, built on data and certainties, had just been shattered by a single round fired from an old rifle by an old woman. He stopped a few feet from her, watching as she wiped down the bolt with an oil-stained cloth. She didn't look up. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. An apology felt cheap and insufficient. An order was unthinkable. So he asked the only question that mattered, the question of a student to a master. "Ma'am," he began, his voice stripped of all its former bluster, now quiet and respectful. "The wind. It shifts over that ravine. My sensors indicated a 5-mile-per-hour cross from the left. But you compensated for something else." He wasn't challenging her. He was pleading for knowledge. Alara Finch finally paused her work and looked up at him. Her eyes were a pale, clear blue, and they held no judgment, no triumph, only a calm, steady assessment. She saw the change in him, the genuine curiosity that had replaced his pride. "The sensors measure the wind where they are, General," she said, her voice soft but clear. "They don't measure the thermal updraft from the sun hitting the shale in the ravine. It creates a vertical lift, just for a few feet, pushes the round high and right. You have to aim low and left into the wind to let the air carry it back to the target." She gestured with her chin. "Look through the scope. Don't look at the target. Look at the heat rising. The air tells you everything if you know how to listen." It was the simplest explanation, and yet it contained a universe of experience he had never considered. It was a teaching moment, offered freely and without condescension. Madsen leaned down, his uniform creasing, and put his eye to the eyepiece of her old scope. The glass was incredibly clear, the image sharp, and as he focused, he saw what she meant. The mirage, the heat shimmer he had always seen as a simple distortion, wasn't uniform. Over the ravine, it danced differently, a subtle vertical ripple in the horizontal flow. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, that no computer would ever be programmed to look for it. It could only be seen by a human eye, and only understood by a mind that had spent a lifetime learning its language. He stood up slowly, a sense of awe washing over him. Sergeant Cole had walked over and was standing nearby, listening intently. The three of them were a strange tableau: the humble general, the veteran NCO, and the living legend. "Why are you here, ma'am?" Cole asked gently, his voice full of respect. "If you don't mind me asking." Alara's expression softened, a flicker of old sadness in her eyes. "My last student trained here," she said quietly. "Sergeant First Class David Chen. He was a good boy, a fine shot. He was killed in the Kunar province 2 months ago. His mother sent me his rifle. This rifle." She patted the stock of the Barrett. "He always said this range felt like home. I just wanted to fire one for him, to let the wind here carry one last round for him." The revelation landed with the force of another .50 caliber round. This wasn't a performance. It wasn't about showing up the general or proving a point. It was a pilgrimage, a deeply personal, solemn act of remembrance, a final lesson from a mentor to her fallen student, a goodbye carried on the desert wind. General Madsen felt a lump form in his throat. He, in his arrogance, had turned her private memorial into a spectacle. He had treated her grief as a sideshow. The shame was acute. He looked at the rifle, no longer seeing it as an old piece of hardware, but as a sacred object, a vessel of legacy and loss. He saw the woman not as an anomaly, but as a guardian of a sacred trust, a keeper of a flame that his modern data-driven army was in danger of extinguishing. He saw the unbroken line of service that stretched from her to Sergeant Chen, and now to Sergeant Cole and the other young shooters on the line. He was just a temporary manager. She was the foundation. She finished packing her rifle, closed the case with a final definitive snap, and stood up. She offered a hand to Sergeant Cole, who took it firmly. "Keep teaching them to read the wind, Sergeant," she said. "The batteries die, but the wind always blows." She then turned to Madsen. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, his training, his instincts, his newfound and profound respect took over. His back straightened, his hand came up in a salute so sharp and precise it could have cut glass. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer. It was the earnest, heartfelt salute of a soldier to a revered warrior. A silent admission of everything he'd been wrong about. Alara Finch didn't salute back. She was a civilian, but she met his gaze and gave him a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement, a nod of forgiveness, a nod that said, "You understand now." Then she turned, walked to her old station wagon, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and 2 fundamentally changed men in her wake. Madsen held his salute until the car was out of sight. He finally lowered his arm and stood in the silence for a long moment, the ping of the bullet hitting the pin echoing in his memory. He had come to the range that morning to inspect technology, to talk about the future of warfare. He was leaving with a lesson in its timeless human heart. He turned to Sergeant Cole, his expression sober and determined. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "cancel my afternoon flight. I'm clearing my schedule." Cole looked at him, waiting. "I want you to walk me through every fundamental," the general continued, "starting with how to read the wind. From the beginning. I want to learn how to listen.